This is Between the Covers, and I'm your host, Joseph Montebello. Today, I'm delighted to have with me Laurie Lisle, author of a wonderful new book entitled 4/10 of an Acre, Reflections on a Gardening Life. Welcome, Laurie. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Before we talk about 4/10 of an Acre, I'm sure our listeners would like to know something about Laurie Lisle herself.
Well, I'm from New England. I'm from Rhode Island. I was born and raised in Providence. And actually, I went to high school in Connecticut, not far from here. After I graduated from college, I moved to New York after working for the Providence Journal-Bulletin. And then I worked for Newsweek.
You were in New York at that point,
Yeah.
writing these books. And then, unlike so many other people who live in New York who take country houses, you just decided to move out.
Well, I was getting divorced, and I had a chance to rethink how I want to live, and I decided I wanted to live in the country and have a garden.
I was going to ask how you chose Sharon, Connecticut, how you chose Connecticut as opposed to, the Hamptons or some other country.
Well, I lived in the Hamptons briefly, actually, and decided that I couldn't buy a big enough garden there. So when I moved up here, I had more land, and I knew Connecticut and from going to high school here, and so I felt very, very comfortable coming up here. And then I found the perfect house.
And you found the house because of the land? You chose the house because of the land, or the land,
I chose the house because of the house. And I chose it in December, and when everything was covered with snow.
Which, as they say, is when you're supposed to choose a house, because then if you see it at its worst, then when you see it later, you're just so happy that you did that.
But I knew nothing about the garden. I mean, all I knew is that there was this stretch of snow out behind the house, which was mine now. And it wasn't until the snow melted that I had any idea about what I was dealing with as a potential garden.
Now, I know from reading the book that your mother and your grandmother were big gardeners.
Yeah.
And did that rub off on you as a child? Did you always did you weed and plant when you were a child?
No, not at all. I was a really I feel now rather badly for my mother, but I never worked in her garden. I never weeded or did anything. I thought it was really boring.
Sounds like my father and me.
And but I did absorb a lot of information without knowing it, because I heard a lot of talk about gardening, and I visited a lot of gardens. Everyone in the family had a garden. So when I came up here and had my own little piece of land, all my genealogy came to the surface, and I became possessed with this gardening instinct.
Did that make your mother happy?
She was thrilled. She was so thrilled I'd left New York and come to...
And got a garden.
And got a garden. And was living in a way that she could relate to.
What I had never thought of, is interesting to me, the correlation you made between women and gardening. I guess there are men gardeners, but I think we tend to think of more women. And I don't know if that's true.
Well, it's very hard to generalize, but if you do dare to generalize, you can say that men often gravitate to landscape design, and women often gravitate to horticulture, to gardening. Perhaps it's because one's a career and one isn't. One's an avocation, one's a vocation.
I wrote this down, this quote from Simone de Beauvoir: "Nature is both a kingdom and a place of exile for women." Do you think most women who garden feel that way?
Well, most women who garden feel it's a great comfort and a refuge, and I think they feel it's a kingdom. Whether or not it's a place of exile is more controversial. It really has a lot to do with whether you think a domestic life is, in a way, an exile, or whether if you're not, working at a job, you're not truly engaged with the world. I mean, I think it can be an exile if you spend too much time there instead of doing other things. I think a garden is a place to go for a while to recharge your batteries. But then once they're recharged, you need to leave.
Do you also feel that it's a place where you can sort of be totally in charge? There isn't anyone telling you what to do
Well,
or how to
except for
do
Mother
it?
Nature.
Yes, Mother Nature.
And sometimes your neighbors, and sometimes your spouse.
I forgot about the neighbors, but you have a neighbor.
I have a neighbor, yeah. And she's very glad that I weed my side, and I'm glad she weeds her side. But there are other neighbors who don't, and there are other neighbors who, where their property abuts mine. It's kind of their wild area with kinds of wild vines and things like that.
Because I remember the discussion in the book about the fence that you replaced.
Mm-hmm. Yes, my former neighbor, even though he had put his house on the market, when I replaced his little fence, his little 4-foot picket fence with a higher fence, he was very offended. Yes, it was very, very touchy. I did wait till he put his house on the market before doing it, but even so.
It's funny what fences do to neighbors.
Yeah.
I, as you know, don't garden very much, but I've read some of the other books, and this is, follows in the tradition of, Green Thoughts and Catherine White and all those. And one of the earliest garden books I ever read was Vita Sackville-West's book, because we published it, actually reissued it at HarperCollins when I was there. Mm-hmm. And I don't know a lot about it, but I think I learned more from your book than I did from any of theirs, I have to say. I actually made notes, underlined things in a hardcover book, which I know I never do usually. So I thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
This is another quote. Learning a little about garden history, remembering my grandmother's gardens and watching my mother has given me an understanding of what the growing world has meant to women all along. It does have to do with creating ephemeral beauty, after all, but it takes effort, energy, and determination to achieve it. But your garden is different from the one your mother had.
Somewhat, yeah. Her garden, she spent more time on her garden, much more time, and than I spent on mine, because that's basically what she did during the gardening season. And her garden is also professionally designed.
Which yours
is not. And I just was in her garden last weekend. She's died. She died last summer.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
And the house is for sale, and the garden is for sale, and until it sells, we have to keep it all up.
And this is fallen onto you.
Well, yes, but and to others. And I spent the weekend weeding her garden, thinking about her, and thinking about how absolutely gorgeous her garden remains. It was very poignant, I have to say. Yeah.
Well, I have all these quotes from you that I am now embedded in me. As my fingers played over this is when you were writing and you wanted to be outside. As my fingers played over the plastic keyboard of my computer, they itched to be holding the wooden handle of a rake or tying up tendrils with soft twine. I struggled to keep my mind on the manuscript because if I ventured outside for even a few minutes, the effortless work of the garden would absorb me in a heartbeat, and it might well be the end of a morning of writing. Well, there are some that wouldn't think that gardening was an effortless. But I understand having done.
To writing it
well, that's it, right? People think that writing's very easy. You just sit down and you've got a thought, and it kind of all comes together.
They don't see the blood on the page, do they?
How did you balance that? Did you write at certain times or did it just depend on the weather in a lot of cases?
Well, I tried to keep a very strict writing schedule because I had a deadline. I always usually have a deadline, and I'd write in the morning, and would then try to get outside in the garden in the afternoon. in April, sometimes the best willpower wasn't good enough, and I would go outside instead of writing on a weekday.
But didn't you mentioned that your attitude toward the book began to change as it began to take more, the pressure of having to finish it.
You're talking about writing the Nevelson biography.
Yes, yes.
Which is what I'm...
Yeah, what you were working on.
Yeah, at that point. Well, yeah, I mean, it took a long time because, for various reasons, having to do with the research I was doing, and also because I wasn't writing as much. All those afternoons outside.
How did you come to write 4/10 of an Acre? How did you...
Well, when I started to garden, it seemed very natural to start keeping garden notebooks, because writers always are writing about whatever they're thinking or doing. It's as natural as breathing. And after a few years, I had quite a pile of these notebooks and notes about the garden. And I thought that it would be really wonderful to write a book about what I'd been experiencing over the past 20 years outside, and I had this rich pile of material to work on. And then I had to think about, how do I structure this? And that's what I did. That's how I came to write the book.
So I was, I learned about gardening, but I, like the way, also learned a lot about you and the things that were going on in your personal life.
Yes.
But all along, the garden was the important player in the book. But it was nice to, sort of know all the other things that were happening to you.
Yeah, it's a combination of a memoir and a garden book, and I use the frame as the garden, as a lens, really, to look at a certain period in my life, and to relate what was happening in the garden and what was happening in my life. And they were very interrelated in many ways.
And did you think twice about revealing so much of your personal life in this book?
Sure. There were moments when I wondered if I was out of my mind. But I think that you have to write about what you need to write about and let the chips fall where they may. And I haven't really had any negative experiences since the book has come out to make me regret doing this.
I think that now we should maybe read a little piece, if you would.
Okay, I'll read.
This is Laurie Lisle reading from her book, 4/10 of an Acre.
I'm going to read a short passage about the first spring of gardening in Sharon, when I fell in love with gardening. That first spring in Sharon, the sword-like leaves of the irises in the middle of the yard began to lengthen, and then green-sheathed buds appeared. One evening, after returning home, I looked out a back window and saw in the twilight that the thick clump of irises had blotches of color held aloft like little flags. Realizing that the buds had begun to burst open, I rushed outside with the puppy at my heels. What I found was an extravagance of fluted blossoms as big as my open hand. 3 ruffled petals stood upright and another 3 dangled down. Each flower was deep purple and white, with caterpillar-like shapes inside, and a slight perfume that took my breath away. They looked so blatant and bold. They flaunted their beauty, defiantly exposing their delicate tissues and unopened buds to the elements. That evening, the blossoming of the iris felt like such a lavish gift of nature, and one given so generously that it marked my capitulation to the gardening life.
And we've been talking to Laurie Lisle and her book, 4/10 of an Acre, Reflections on a Gardening Life. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm your host, Joseph Montebello.